ನಾನು ಆವಾಗ ಚಿಕ್ಕವನು, he treated me like one of the boys, put his arm around me and very often sir would say, no. He says, no, he would just do like this. So it was that kind of a relationship. He was a very rare person and a very large-hearted person. And how I got posted, I'll tell you. Mr. Rebello, the chief secretary, told me. He said, when the post was created and somebody had to be posted, I asked the CM, well, now the post is there, whom do you want to be posted? He said, well, I don't want a Vokaliga or a Lingayat. You better give me an outsider. And then Mr. Lin said, well, lot of letter writing has to be done here, so I want somebody who can write. And then Mr. Rebello said, I had seen your letters and I said, this boy can write. So I got posted straight from the subdivision to the CM's office. And for me, it was a revelation because Mr. Lin had earlier worked with the CM and had been in service for over a decade when he joined the CM. But for me, coming straight from the subdivision, it was quite a different experience. In a way, I sort of grew up under Mr. Lin's mentoring. Now, this tells you something about Mr. Arsu's character. These days, everybody wants people from their caste or their community and they want to look only at the welfare of their community. But he said, no, you better give me an outsider. And this is the kind of person he was. Whenever he went on tour, if it was purely political, then either Moinuddin or Shastri accompanied him. But he had started this system of reviewing the district administrations. So whenever he had to do district administration, then I accompanied him. And those days, there was no state plane or helicopter, so one traveled by road only. In fact, there was once a suggestion made that we should also have a plane for the CM, and Mr. Lin and I both discussed it. And then because I had been accompanying him and earlier sir had accompanied him, we both said, look, when he travels by road, he observes so many things. People stop him and they give him representations, he talks to them. And also at the border, the DC and the SP join him, and the kind of feedback they give him is invaluable, which otherwise he would miss. So both of us advised against getting a plane for the CM, and all his touring he did by road. And when I traveled with him, he was very fond of Charles Dickens and was a great admirer of the Mahabharata. So we would talk about Dickens, we would talk about the Mahabharata, because I had done masters in literature, so Dickens was one of my favorites also, and David Copperfield was his favorite Dickens work. And he had many quotations from Micawber and others, and he would talk about that. And in college, he had studied geology and botany. And I was also a student of earth sciences. In fact, geomorphology, geography, etc. were my subjects also in college. And I was greatly interested in botany also, thanks to my father who taught me at home. So we would be talking about trees and plants and rock formations. We would point out to each other, this is Maradihalli pillow lava and this is this rock formation, and then we would have discussion about that. Now, people don't realize that there are very few politicians with whom you can have this kind of a discussion about literature, about plants, about nature, about rocks, rock formations, etc. And he was a very sensitive person about these things. A very refined sensibility. Maybe it came because of the palace associations or whatever. I had many friends among musicians, etc. So I don't know if sir remembers, quite a few times I organized Veena programs at his house, or if there was some very good music program in Ravindra Kalakshetra. At that time we had only Ravindra Kalakshetra, there was no Chaudhaiya and there were no other venues. I would take him and he would come. So this was another dimension of his. And whenever we came across a good book or a good article, both of us, we would discuss and then we would pass on to him and, sir, I think you should read this. And he would read and then discuss with us. And as sir was mentioning, he always tried to convince you. Once there was something which he had to speak about in the assembly, and I was saying, sir, how can you say this? And sir motioned to me like this, that keep quiet. And then he turned around to him, he said, no, how can I convince all those people there in the assembly if I cannot convince Chiranjeevi Singh? You know, that's the sort of person he was. I mean, this is something unimaginable in today's context. And his generosity, of course, very often, because I also handled this CM's relief fund there, once or twice there were people about whom we knew that they were opposed to him politically. I remember there was one person from Belgaum who had spoken very bitterly against him and written about him, etc. But then, because of some misfortune, he needed financial relief and he came to the CM. And he gave a representation, and Linsa passed him on to me. And knowing the background, I was wondering what to do. And then I spoke to the CM. I saw him, I said, sir, this is the case. He said, no, he is in need now. You give it to him. And very generously from CM's relief fund he was given. So that was the kind of person in these humanitarian issues. He never looked at the political side, that so and so is my opponent or so and so is my supporter. If a person was in need, he would help him. Though he was a congressman, but as I said, during those long car journeys, we would discuss of everything under the sun, and I would say that he was a Lohiite at heart. His political philosophy was that of Lohia, because he always went by this: in India, caste is class, which is, you can say, the basic philosophy of Lohia. And that's what he built upon. Of course, towards the end, sir was saying he had a falling out with Mrs. Gandhi and he was very bitter about her. Because the two brothers, Kemprajars and they passed away after a short interval, a few months this thing. Now, Kemprajarsu's son-in-law was a Punjabi, and he was used to Punjabi food at his house. So very often, and I was unmarried. Those days I was single, and I had a cook whom my mother had taught Punjabi cooking. So whenever he wanted some Punjabi food, he would drop in at home. And we would have a merry conversation, because Kemprajars was a great conversationalist, talking about his cinema days and various things, and much more outgoing than his brother. In some ways, I think, sir, Mr. Ars was more of an introvert. He was more of an introvert. It was Kemprajars who was the extrovert of the two brothers. So when he died, I was then in Delhi. And I came down. I was then in the Ministry of Defence. I was going to Trivandrum, but I chose to go via Bangalore. I thought I would see Mr. Ars. He was not the CM then. And he switched on the, we chatted, and he switched on the transistor. And the news was coming about the Congress I losing in Haryana by elections, and he was very happy, and he said, no, this is what we are going to do all over the country. He said he was all set to fight against Congress I, even in the north, and he was learning Hindi because of that. He says, yes, I must learn Hindi to do that. And then, of course, various things happened, and unfortunately he passed away soon. But his generosity of spirit, his generosity of heart was, I think, something unparalleled. I mean, among the political class, he was really a big man. Sometimes when he would be speaking in the assembly, and one of us from the CM's office would be there in the front row, and with his profile, handsome profile, chiseled features, he looked like a Roman senator speaking. I always thought of a Roman senator. He was fond of good things of life, and the other remarkable thing was that from Hunsur, whoever came from Hunsur, he knew them by name. It's amazing. And that's the reason why he never lost an election in Hunsur. His rapport with the people of his constituency was something amazing. He knew everybody, he knew their problems, and of course, as has been mentioned, he was always wary of Lingayats, and probably those are the political compulsions. We sort of didn't go into those things. Maybe the politicians would speak about that, but as far as the administration is concerned, it was trust based. You see, he had people of his choice. Earlier, as Chief Secretary, he had Mr. Rebello, one of the finest officers. Then he had Mr. G.V. Karao, a legendary person. He had Mr. K. Balasubramaniam in revenue, Mr. Satish Chandran in finance, Mr. Vardhan as PWD, and Maktoum in irrigation. He had his team in place, Mr. Hanuman in the home department, and he trusted the team, and the team delivered. And as Sir had started this off the record, this thing, I remember during the emergency, he would pass on all these MISA files to me, and you had to, the stack of those files, one had to get his signatures, and sometimes on this note we had to put another small note, CMA, please read this before signing the file. I mean, that was the extent of trust he had in the team, and the team delivered. Of course, when he came, immediately in 72, he had this great famine, I mean the great drought, which is rated as 3 of the worst droughts of the 20th century. And so the first test he had was test of fire, this drought relief business. And the way he toured in the northern parts of Karnataka, which were suffering very badly, and the way he tackled it by trusting his team. The DCs who were in the field, like J.K. Rora in Bijapur and Muttanna in Belgaum and others, administration was, I would say, trust-based administration. Not like today, when you can't handle things, you start blaming the officers and you start berating them for your own weaknesses. He never did that. In fact, once there was criticism of the Chief Secretary in the assembly, and he got up and he said, bureaucracy is the horse that we ride. You don't blame them. I am there. So that was the kind of person he was. He won't blame the officers for something which is not done. He would say, that's the horse we are riding. That's the kind of person he was. Because when he was very fond of his brother and Nagratna, when Nagratna died, Sir was mentioning about Nagratna's death. I was then in Delhi and I went to Karnatak Bhavan again to offer my condolences. That's the only time I saw his eyes filled up with tears. Unfortunately, all these things happened in succession. He coped with it as best as he could. ನಾನು ಆವಾಗ ಚಿಕ್ಕವನು. He treated me like one of the boys, put his arm around me and very often sir would say, no. He says, no. He would just do like this. So it was that kind of a relationship. Like an elderly person and a youngster. But you see, I was the original environmentalist in the government. Sir was always for development and I was always for environment, etc. And therefore we always had discussions. Now looking back on it, I would say that he was the accelerator and I was the brake. For example, to many of the things I would say no, that this should not be done. And in some cases, CM would good-naturedly listen to the brake part of it, and often he would go along with the accelerator part of it. But this is how it was. So I would say I was indulged as a youngster as any elder would indulge a youngster. You see, there was no department of culture, etc. at that time. I mean, I was put in additional charge of the information department also, because what happened was, when emergency was imposed, the state directors also became the chief censors for the state. So just then, the day the emergency was imposed, I think a day before that, the director of information and publicity, who was to be the chief censor, he retired. So the question was whom to post. And he and Mr. G.V.K. Rao were discussing, because censorship was then a big thing during the emergency. And I walked in with a file and Mr. G.V.K. Rao said, let's make him director of information. So this was an additional charge which was given to me. And culture was then part of this information department only. There was a song and drama division with people like C.R. Simha and Nagesh, Kapana, all the luminaries of Karnataka cinema and stage, Uma Shivkumar, earlier Lokesh, etc. All these people were there. It was doing a great job, and Mr. Anand Rao, one of the great cultural icons of the state, was there as the joint director. I mean, this is another thing which people should remember, that the impact of emergency in Karnataka was never what it was in the north. And as chief censor, I remember one day at about 9:30, Mr. Hanuman, who was then the Home Secretary, he called me and he said that there were instructions from Delhi that you hold the proof copies of the Indian Express till morning and release them only in the morning. The implication was that you release them in the morning, it goes to the press by afternoon and no one would read a daily paper in the afternoon. So the paper naturally would lose circulation. When he told me, I said, but there was nothing in writing. I said, sir, but this is illegal. He washed off his hands. He says, then you decide what you want to do. So I called Mr. Ars around 10 in the night. I said, sir, this is what is, but this is illegal. He just said, if it is illegal, don't do it. And after the emergency was lifted, and when Shah Commission came to Bangalore, and then to my pleasant surprise, I discovered that Bangalore was the only city, only edition in India, because Indian Express had multiple editions. This was the only edition which had come out. And the credit for that goes to Mr. Ars, because he said to me, if it is illegal, don't do it. This is the kind of person he was. You see, here also people were jailed. It's not that they were not jailed. Now, Snelata Reddy and Pattabhiram Reddy were almost my neighbors, and they were friends. So when Sneha was jailed, I naturally, like everybody else, I was very upset, and I spoke to sir, and then I told the CM, sir, we can't do that. He just smiled. And but because I was pestering sir, and he saw to it. He told the police that make sure that they are not troubled and all. So this was the kind of thing, because bigger people like Advani and all who are also here in jail, they naturally were treated as they should be treated. But even people like Snehata Reddy and all, those Snehata Reddy's diary which came after the emergency was lifted is a different thing. But there was never any excess and nothing which you could blame the CM for. Even where things occurred, unfortunately it were some of the officers who overstepped on their own, because very often the DCs are young people, and this kind of power given to them, which was given during the emergency, they are unable to handle that kind of power with maturity. So that happened. But even there, it was not the same. In fact, because of my experience as probationer and as AC, I saw in 2 years 6 DCs come and go. I mean, from a very senior and a very mature person like Mr. Balagopalan, 54 batch, replaced by an officer of 66 batch, and you could see the difference. I told sir, I said, and we spoke to the CM, I said, sir, do not post people to districts before they have done 12 years. Then sir said, no, 12 years will be too late, because we need younger people also. So the compromise was 8 to 10 years of seniority. That was then made as a policy. I don't know if later on they changed it or not, or what the policy continues to be, but this was the reason. And I think this helped during the emergency, because you had people who had experience of administration and could handle the situation with certain amount of maturity. You see, I would repeat what sir has said, that Karnataka has been lucky with its chief ministers. But incidentally, I would say that in his mind, he was always, when he was answering questions, he always had 2 persons in mind. One was Nijalingappa Sahab. He always he wanted to compare his achievements with Mr. Nijalingappa's. Secondly, whenever he had to prepare for answers in the council, where Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde was the leader of the opposition, he took extra care. These were the 2 people he really sort of mentally he put himself, I should say, against, or I mean as kind of measuring rod. And Karnataka has been lucky, because you had people like them. But I would say, which I have said elsewhere also, that there have been 4 major turning points. The unification of Karnataka, when Mr. Nijalingappa was the CM, and handling the unification issues, one. The second was the self-respect given to the downtrodden, and the people's empowerment. I would call it what sir was mentioning as the rise of the backward classes. I would say people's empowerment. This is the second turning point. That was Mr. Arsu's. The third turning point was introduction of the Panchayati Raj, Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde's. And the fourth turning point is giving powers to the Gram Panchayats. On paper, actually, Karnataka has given all the powers which are envisaged in the 73rd Amendment of the Constitution to the Gram Panchayats. It's a different, and that is by Dharam Singh, which is a very big step which will have its impact in future. So I would say these are the 4 major turning points in the administrative history of the state. And but I mean, people have been taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. It's that kind of a movement which is there. But he was in a class apart. And the major CMs, I mean, by major I mean those who have had a long tenure and an impact on the administration of the state, Mr. Arsu stands very tall amongst them. I think that whole, see, there was a ferment at that time, and like a strong leader gives the direction which was given. I mean, that kind of ferment you saw in the initial years of introduction of the Panchayati Raj system also, when Mr. Hegde introduced it. No, even those who were brought up by him, in any case they left him, so they left everything that he stood for.